It's a great pleasure to have listened to be a part of this meeting. It's been actually a long time that I've had the opportunity to listen to such great speakers and scholarship and to get immersed in it again and to be exposed and excited by the ideas that all of you presented. I'm going to be a little bit plainer, you know. I'm a military psychiatrist, right? I'm a blue-collar guy, and but I hope to fire you up and get you excited about what I'm also very grateful to all of you who are taking the time and energy in your personal lives and professional lives to do what you can for those Americans who have been out there and who volunteered and who have felt the drive themselves and the privilege of defending us and protecting our freedoms. And I want to thank you all for that. I'll start with some disclaimers. Actually, I'm a psychoanalytic training reject. Oh, well, that's good. You can give me... I went through my analysis. Clearly, no one thinks it succeeded. But I was in this little program in med school thinking that maybe I wasn't quite wired right and maybe I should learn some more psychiatry. And one thing led to another. And after our second year, we got into the Baltimore Psychoanalytic Institute. I said, this is pretty cool. And then the Army decided that I needed to leave Baltimore, and went out to San Francisco, and I thought I'd be able to transfer, and the interviewer and I just didn't quite, as they say down south, jee-haw. We didn't quite get it, you know? So I did not do any more training. But I find no matter what, you know, and things you get 40 years ago sort of get embedded, and those ideas have been embedded in me, and I'm going to try and capture them as I talk. Now, probably one of the more possibly symptomatic parts of my analysis, with a great deal of embarrassment, I confess that I almost killed Professor Erickson's father. This is a true story, okay? For those of you who know Mill Valley, and that little center area there, a little plaza in Mill Valley, I was fortunate enough that one of the smart business moves I made is in 1979 was early on, my wife and I bought a little house there. And on Saturdays, we would go down and we'd have a little coffee. You know, I had a great little bookstore down before Starbucks came in and kind of sort of scandalized all this lifestyle. And we had a little coffee and pastry and bread, and we thought we were erudite. And I got in my car, which I really loved. It was this Alfa Romeo, you know. I just, you know. But it was the sedan one. It was neat, you know. It was really neat. And I'm in the car, and you know, it's got 5 gears, and I'm in there, and I put it in reverse, and I go look back, and all of a sudden my wife yells, "Stop!" And I slam on the brakes, and sure enough, the back bumper had hit your father. He looked at me, and he sort of recognized me because he was a fellow at that time at Langley Porter at UCSF. I looked at him, and my wife says, "You almost killed Eric Erickson." She says, "How did you do that?" She said, I said, "Well, he's in my blind spot." She says, "Are you having a transverse problem?" She was also in analysis. And I said, "You know, darling, sometimes a blind spot is just a blind spot." She says, "You'd never be able to talk your way out of that one." So that comes back. I'm glad to be at the Erickson Institute. I'm glad that your dad lived. And I went on to have some sort of checkered career after that. And then, interestingly, found myself in what I'm going to use to anchor this talk is some 20 plus years after that. I've been retired a couple years, and it sort of popped up again after 9/11, trying to alert the Department of Defense as everybody's getting all geared up. Let's start thinking about what's going to happen. And one day, I was living in Georgia. I was a widower, raising my kids more or less, and this reporter calls, and she says, "I've heard you're a psychiatrist and a retired general and one of these guys who speaks out." She says, she was with U.S. News and World Report. We're doing a cover story, and they ended up doing it on Freud, and I'm responsible for doing the cover story on Freud. Says, what do you think, based on 9/11, we should use as possible way to organize it? She had a very nice voice. I really liked her voice. So I said, well, let me see what I can pull out, what we call in the Army ex rectum. The Catholics call it ex cathedra. I got this one. So I said, all right, well, what I think's happened missing has been, at least Freud, for all that you could say about him, at least he thought he had an idea. He thought he had a model, and that's something that you need, right? As a general, you need a plan. Good, bad, you need a plan. You need a way to explain what you're doing. And she says, oh, I like that. I don't know anything about it. So we talked a little bit more. She got a great cover story, which I used with medical students, September 2003. I got a date. And a marriage. She's my wife. And it's nice, right? Pretty good. She still struggles to make me literary, but, that's all right. But, here's the thing that struck me about that. And I'm going to read it to you. It says, so he opens, I've got this we pulled this out. He called it the quantitative line of approach. He says, this approach is derived directly from pathological clinical observations, especially from those concerned with excessively intense ideas. Excessively intense ideas. He then goes on and says, processes such as stimulus, substitution, conversion, and discharge, which had to be described in connection with hysteria and obsessional neuroses, directly suggest the notion of viewing neuronic excitation as quantities in a condition of flow. Wow. Right? Pretty... What was this, 1905? So it's exactly right. Those words, we change them, modify them, right? Those are the words and language we use. PTS, excessively into flashbacks. Are we talking about flashbacks? Are we talking about, intrusive thoughts? Are we talking about the sympathetic discharge? Here's a guy who realized that there was something in the way that the brain operated that would manifest itself in the psychology of the individual, and particularly of people who'd had certain stressful, traumatizing experiences. So, now, that's not a popular thing to say, to go back and sort of revive this fellow and say, he had a good idea. The other quote that I really like, my wife put in the article, was from Robert Stickle, who I've not read much. He said, Freud was 50% right and 100% wrong. Well, but you know what we say in the Army? You know what we say in the Army? Not always right, but never in doubt. I don't think you analysts ever do that, do you? Never ever, right? So, okay. Not always right, but you got to have just a little bit. Now let me kind of pull you back about what I'm going to try and do here, and talk a little bit what it's like to be a general. And for a period of time, allow you to sort of transport yourself into a general's persona. And probably the easiest way to explain it is what happens to us when we get promoted to general officers. Because there's something very symbolic that happens there that then ends up playing out and transforming the way we think about our role as military officers and leaders. So in the Army, those of you who have served know that when you wear what we call our Class A's, that is our suit, we have on the brass, we have a U.S. up here, and then down here we have our corps brass, right? Artillery, or medical service corps, infantry, armor. So it identifies what corps medical corps, what corps we belong to. Through the rank of colonel, we have one stripe on our sleeve, and we have one stripe that goes down our pants. So when I got promoted, and we were in the Greens, when general officers, you get promoted to general, you take your corps brass off. Of course, you get a thicker braid here, and you get two stripes down your pants. Now, why do you take your corps brass off? Because you are a general. You are a generalist. You are now going to think about the mission in a much broader way than you have ever thought about it before. Go and think Clausewitz. Because I'm going to use some language. I realized when I was listening to the conversation and then reading my paper, I've got code words here that you all may or may not really, capture the connotation of. In Clausewitz, who wrote On War, which is sort of the basic text for us, he talked about 3 levels of planning and how we conduct warfare: the tactical, the operational, and the strategic. Very important. And in fact, it's a little bit what happens in this organizational psychology world. Had conversation with Jerry. I've done a lot of that as well, and worked with a fellow who's a student of Elliot Jaques. Some of you may know, an analyst and a student of Piaget. And these ideas play into there when you're thinking about an organization and how you're going to set it up and select leaders. The tactical level is what happens on the front lines. It's what you do in the squad. You're going out, you're on a mission, you've got an objective, you're going to take that objective, it's clear. You're going to do that in the course of the day. It's what we do in our clinics. We're going to see our patients, we're going to knock them out, not knock them out, but I'm talking like an administrator. And so we're going to, so we're going to get our workload up. And we're going to move through it. The operational level is that way of running an organization as if I were a battalion commander or a brigade commander or a clinic chief or maybe a department chief. I've got to, I've got clinicians of a particular specialty. I've got an infantry brigade. I've got, the objectives. But I've got to organize a bigger level of operations. And I really got to think out a little bit more of how I'm going to conduct that operation. and requires your ability to understand many more variables and do the calculus for those variables in terms of how you accomplish the bigger mission. The strategic is really the big campaign plan. It's Dave Petraeus and Jack Keane and the surge in Iraq in 2007, when we go from being in the green zone to the coin strategy, and we're going to take the guys and we're going to really go out into the communities. It was the change from Westmoreland to Abrams, from the body count to the bigger plan, that how we were going to go about and run that war. For this purposes, the strategic is something that came back to mind in 2007 for me, when it turned out that the chairman, newly selected chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mike Mullen, and I ended up with a group of captains in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Now, Mike and I had been one-stars together. The other thing that happens is, as a general, not only do they get to change your uniform, you go to charm school. I didn't do so well. I want to do that. There's always got to be a guy at the bottom of the class. They still call you general or doctor, but there's always a guy at the bottom of the class. Mike obviously did very well, and he deserved it. He's a very, very fine officer. We were sitting with these captains who had 1-2 tours in Iraq. They were back. It was what's called their advanced course. They're kind of learning the next level of stuff they need to do as officers. And they're getting ready to see if they're going to be majors, which is they're going to go in a different career thing. And they're telling us their stories. And it's all artillery stuff. And Mike and I start, we separately are asking questions. I was on another absolutely fruitless project at that time. And I said, Steve, what do you think? I said, hey. He says, I agree with you. We got problems. I said, we got problems, Mike. We got real problems. You and I were in Vietnam. We saw what happened. We saw what happened then. We saw what happened afterwards when we got out. We saw all the problems, how long it took for people to recognize what Agent Orange was like and all those problems. We can read the tea leaves. He says, I agree with you. He says, I'm the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I need to figure out what I can do as chairman. Right? He is at the most strategic level of what he can do to influence and prepare the entire Department of Defense for what he instinctively perceives as the consequences of, at that point, 5-6 years of war. So you think that, but it's not that easy. Even as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is the first among equals. And the Department of Defense is a huge bureaucracy. It is really tough. And you've got great advisors, great inside people here with Jonathan and Frank and Brett and Nancy, great inside people working to make a difference and move that bureaucracy along. But as I was trying to convey earlier this morning, there are a lot of obstacles, huge obstacles, including the fact that in many respects, the people just don't want to see what was going on. They had their own blind spots. In 2007, it was all about fighting the war. It was all about defeating the enemy, clearly. And even in several conversations that I had with 4 stars, saying, if you're going to think that this is going to go on 4 and 5 years, I had a direct conversation with a very, very important 4-star about sleep, right? It is the golden road. Because sleep is sort of the golden road of what the problems are that the soldiers are having and Marines, and it's fixing sleep is how you get them well in many ways. He said, Steve, and we were very good friends, are very good friends. He said, Steve, the only thing that's going to get these guys more sleep is for us to kill more Iraqis. I could not believe it. This is an extremely erudite, smart man. So, what we're doing, what you're doing here is picking up the pieces. Now, and I really salute you for doing that, because we need to do that as energetically, as creatively, as conscientiously as we can. The numbers are these. Since 2002, when we did our first missions in Afghanistan, we have had 2.5 million different individuals deploy to the combat theaters. Different Social Security numbers. Many of them have deployed several times. Of the ones we, in our surveys, even identify as having some sort of problem, psychiatric, it's about 27%, probably. And then you've got another 20% or so who, separate from that, a lot of overlap, who've had mild traumatic brain injury, IED blast injuries. And then you've got a whole other order that we've not even captured numerically, who've got musculoskeletal injuries and pains. These infantrymen are carrying 90-pound packs. So up and down, they were in the desert in Iraq, huge, hot, tough circumstances, up and down the hills of Afghanistan. I mean, the bodies of these 25-year-olds are like 40-year-olds. We're starting now to get the data that these guys have prematurely aged. We had the indications of that in 2007. We were screening captains and majors at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And we were finding a third of these men are in about 30 plus or minus. A third of them had hypertension. The stress, the physiologic burden is huge. So do the numbers. Well, what do you want to say? 40%, 45% just from surveys have got some sort of identifiable medical, psychiatric, neurological problem? That's out of 2.5 million, 800,000. That's just the ones that you can see. We all know that all these colonels aren't going to tell you a thing about how tough their lives are. They ain't going to tell you nothing, man. And they're broken as well. So this is a bit of an epidemic when you've got 800,000 people who are coming out of a war with a set of problems like this. And then how many lives do they touch? 2, 3, 4 lives? Families, immediate? That's huge numbers. So that gets into the millions. Becomes a legitimate epidemic. The implication, though, is, and I'm going to get to the politics, it's not that war is bad. There are bad guys out there. There are serious problems to our national security and to the safety of our people. to have a good, strong, committed, professional military ends up being very, very important to us. We need that, and we can help that because we can sustain that military while it's at war and afterwards. But go back to Clausewitz, war is just politics by another means. Every general and admiral, before they are approved for promotion, goes before the Senate Armed Services Committee and has to have an individual confirmation. We don't have a hearing. If you're a 3 and a 4-star, you have to have an in-person hearing. As a 1 and a 2-star, you do not. We serve our government. We are political officers because we are here to serve the purposes of the government. It's really, so I want to embed that, frame that thinking in terms of where we're going forward. Now, the reason I'm going to spend some time, and I think all I'm going to be able to do is lay out for you what I would bring in as elements for a model sort of like the project. What's missing today in all the great things that are being done from the levels of the highest, from the planners in the Department of Defense, the White House actually, the DOD and the VA, is some way to tie all this together and explain why we're going forward and how we're going forward and why we're doing what we're doing when you've got hundreds of thousands of people. I am fascinated, and I'll end it with some comments about moral injury. I am fascinated by this conversation because it truly informs what I would do as a clinician and a planner. But I also feel the burden and the weight of figuring out what to do sooner than later for hundreds of thousands of men and women. We've got to do something now. And in order to do that, you've got to have a plan. It doesn't have to be a perfect plan. We just got to have a plan. An 80% plan is okay. It changes anyway. The minute you pass what we call the FLOT, the front line of troops, you have the best plan in the world. All of a sudden, goes out the window. But at least you got a plan. You know where you're going. So I spend my time with two groups of people that would generally be classified as traumatized. And my clinical work and my research work and consulting. First are the soldiers, and then I spent a lot of time in Guantanamo. And I want to talk to you, they're a different group of people. But when you're thinking about these sets of problems and disorders, I think both populations will inform you about what we're trying to do. So, as you've heard, over the 10 years, the volunteers have changed. And it's changed in terms of the qualifications, in terms of what our requirements are for recruitment. Some years are good years. We only take high school graduates. Their records are clean. Everything's wonderful. Some years are not so good. And we take young folks who have got GEDs. They've had prior arrests. They've had a couple of drug charges. Any number of these people have had early trauma, family breakups, all sorts of problems. So we've got lots of different folks all coming in to be soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen. Many of them felt that they were not cut to be able to go to college. They were not folks that had the qualification or the intelligence or were interested that academically. They were not prepared to go to college. And they weren't sure what they were going to do. They're from Midwestern states, they're from Southern states, they're middle class, lower middle class, and their ticket out from their little town was joining the military. They come in, And they go through basic training, what we call AIT, Advanced Individual Training. It's pretty traditional, hasn't really changed much, some changes. Then they go to their first unit. Combat unit, or what we call combat support unit. And for most of these years, they'd get to a unit and that unit was on the bubble that it would be deploying in 6 to 9 months. So they're the junior person in that unit. They're going to be part of a squad. Their squad leader has probably had 1 or 2 tours himself. I'm going to talk mostly infantry. He's got a fresh young kid, depending on what that kid is. If he's overweight, in shape, if the kid's overweight, he's going to smoke him. You know what I mean by smoke him? He's going to duck walk, and he'll be doing a lot of push-ups, and be scrubbing a lot of bathrooms with toothbrushes. But he's going to get that kid ready to go to war. Goes to war, and I think, as we've heard, it's not what they trained for. They trained to be part of a particular infantry unit. This is what was going to happen. They were going over, pretty clear, and it's not what it ends up to be, and it's really confusing. Really, really confusing. In the early parts of the war, when the IEDs first came out, and we did not recognize either the dangers and or the injuries, these kids were themselves putting metal on their Humvees to up-armor their Humvees. They were having themselves to take protective action to what was going on. Now, when they're in theater, and I recommend how many of you seen the movie, Sebastian Junger's movie, Restrepo? Great movie, right? I think he was a pretty good, captured what happened in the FOBs pretty clearly. The other one is Baghdad ER, Frontline. My former driver, and I'm really referring to him in lots. My driver, when I was a general, went on to be a PA and is one of the people that's spotlighted in that movie. And his story is, he says, "Sir," it's great to be called sir again. He says, "Sir, look, I get over there and I'm awake 36 hours or awake 48 hours. We got guys coming in who are just as blown up and bad off as you could ever imagine. And then I might get 12 hours sleep, and then I'm back on 36, I might get 24. He says the first thing that goes bad is your sleep." Back to Jonathan's point. First sign that things are not working is their sleep goes off and they can't everything loses its the regular circadian rhythm loses that regularity to it, and that starts to get things bad. And they don't know how to calm themselves down, they don't control themselves, they can't get into a routine. Happens a lot with the infantry guys. They don't know when they're going to be awakened to go out on a mission. A lot of them are up on uppers and downers. One way or another, they get drugs. They've got a lot of aches and pains, and a lot of them are taking ibuprofen, right? They call Ranger candy. Interestingly, recent public, just last month in the Green Journal, we find that ibuprofen interferes with methylation and may be one of the reasons we have so-called treatment-resistant depression in middle-aged people, sort of like the case we saw yesterday. Right? But that's all these guys are on. And then about now, with the multiple deployments, we've got about 27% of them are on some sort of psychotropic. Antidepressant, a lot of them taking Seroquel, Trazodone, blah, 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 blah. And just think back of the other parts of the conversation about, state of mind when incidents occur, and on medication, off medication, how it begins to imprint itself in your amygdala, hippocampus, pick some region of the brain that how's your frontal cortex supposed to modulate that? Pick some region of your brain you think is important, and know that it is also being influenced by the medications going on. All right, so that's the real world. When you guys come in, look, we all have problems connecting with patients. It's not because I'm a uniform guy that I was a general. You talk about being on the dark side of the force. You know, how was the worst of those Captain Doyle's? Sir, you don't know what's going on, sir. You're right, soldier. I don't know what's going on, but you know what? I know it ain't right with you. You and I are going to have a talk with Jesus today. Got to do that, you know. And after a while, you break through it, you know. And then after a while, conversations happen. So that's point one. That's what these guys do. Cannot underestimate, with this population, the exposure to IED blasts. It was ignored. It was suppressed. You know, and I know that there are those within the inner circle of the highest levels of the military that feel that I am too critical at times. But the fact, and I tried to be tactful. It failed just like my analysis did. And I think the only thing we can do is a frontal assault. You guys, I'm saying the uniformed guys in the DoD Health, decided that IED blasts were not a problem up through 2009. Charlie Hogue published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine that said every symptom that we've got from IED blasts can be explained by PTSD. Well, that's ridiculous. Because IED blasts cause, as we know now with neuroimaging, axonal shearing, microscopic hemorrhages, and any number of disturbances in the connections across the regions of the brain. And particularly they affect the frontal lobes that are so important with all of our executive functioning. And these guys just are having problems getting the job done and getting themselves up and to work in the morning. So that's that group of patients that I'm trying to make sense of. Remember, I'm just a blue-collar guy trying to make sense of everyday world where I'm seeing guys who've got problems, and I think, you know, that this society has invested in me the privilege of being a physician, and therefore I should try and do the best that I can. Now, the second group that was a very unusual experience for me was that I got kidnapped in 2004 and been held hostage since then. And I'm in a work therapy program of what to do with detainees in Guantanamo. And this happened because I was just, you know, an accident, asked to interview for a very high-level job at the White House in 2004. Actually, Department of Defense. And as that was going on, the Abu Ghraib scandal broke. I said, hey guys, we have a problem. You know, we can't do this. We can't, and the medics talk about high-level ethics. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where the ethical structure, temperament, disposition, ethical courage of the DoD meets the road. We do not torture. The American Army does not torture. We should not in any way condone torture. It hurts them and it hurts us in all sorts of ways. And we as a profession, within the profession of the military, who colluded with it and became members of the interrogation teams called the Biscuits, where you had 2 psychologists and several psychiatrists who went down there and worked with them under CIA guidance and developed what we call now the enhanced interrogation techniques. We have corrupted our ethical core by doing that. We've got to get it straight. We've got to own up to it. So, not that I'm a great courageous guy or anything like that, but you know, I grew up right in the in a military. I'm from a military family. Very aware of the legacy of Nuremberg. I lived in Japan, went to high school in Japan in the 60s. I saw even that. My father was in 3 wars. You know, I feel strongly and stood up that we were not going to do that. What happened was I then started getting I wrote an article. My good wife, the journalist, said you should write an article for the Washington Post, and it got published in the Outlook. And I started getting these calls. And I'm a child psychiatrist, and I got a call regarding a young man who had been captured at 15 named Omar Khader. Okay. So and I'll give you a brief synopsis, and then I'll get to you what I think are the elements of the project. Khader, who Thursday, I was glad to see that the New York Times published one of my other rants about him in an op-ed. And 2 years before, I had also written something about what I thought my criticism of the prosecution psychiatrist. 15 years old, born in Canada. Father Ahmed was probably a very senior person financing Osama bin Laden, killed by Pakistanis in 2003. Dad, as he tended to do, son, very good boy. Omar's a very good young man. Gifted in languages, sent him as a translator to Libyans Libyan expatriates had been thrown out by Gaddafi. Were in Khost in Afghanistan, and they were training the local Pashtuns to make IEDs. And Omar was able to translate from the Arabic to the Pashto and help them. Our forces, discovered the compound. Special forces attacked it. Omar is blinded and severely wounded in the first minutes of the attack. Attack goes on for another 4 hours. All the Libyans are killed. He's shot through the back, has 2 huge wounds. You can see them on the internet. They're ugly. But lives. Our medics, God bless them, save him. Tragically, an American medic, Sergeant First Class, is wounded with a grenade, and he dies 10 days later. Omar's the only survivor. So he's charged with murder. 15 years old. Put in Bagram, tortured. Wait till he's 16. And so after he's 16, his birthday was in September, the attack occurred in July, he's moved to Gitmo. So this is 2003, he finally gets to Gitmo. I first see him December 2008. I've spent hundreds of hours with him. And over that time, I've actually spent, now not perhaps another 100 hours or so with a bunch of other detainees down there. And it's ended up that I've done a good deal of human rights work across the country. And I've seen victims in all sorts of places who have, been shackled and beaten and shot and all sorts of problems like that. So Omar is tortured, and he doesn't really, here's how it comes out clinically. He's very contained, he's very religious, he's a very, really, really decent young man who, everything's okay, sir, I'm all right, everything's fine, and I'm trying to build the case, figure out how I can help the defense. He says, can you do a physical exam? And I don't tell him I'm a psychiatrist. And yes, sure, not a problem. And God bless the doctors at Gitmo. They say, yeah, you can do a physical exam, but you have to bring your own instruments. So what do you mean? What's going on here? And they don't have a place for me to examine him. One of the guards takes pity on me. He says, sir, come over here. I got a bed. I got a place for you to examine Khader. Great. We go in, and all of a sudden, Omar has an anxiety attack. What happened? He says, you know this room? He says, you know what they did to me in this room? Or like this? Do you know what walling is? Walling is when they built a false wall like this, and they would throw the guy repeatedly against the wall, actually probably inducing mild traumatic brain injury, thinking that if they kind of knocked his brain cells loose, he would tell us the truth. I know where that idea came from because I remember reading it in the 60s and 70s when I was at Letterman. So they walled him. The other thing is that they used him as a human mop, which is that, they would hydrate him, wouldn't let him go to the bathroom, tell him to pee on the floor, then they'd make him sort of swim around and clean it up with his own clothes. We won't talk about there are a lot of variations and sophistications to waterboarding. So he has a frank anxiety attack, and then he finally starts to tell me about these things. What I've discovered over the years, as I've interviewed him and a number of other people, that of course this was common. And these men, they're all men, are very, very symptomatic. Talk about flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, sleep disturbances, somatic complaints, aches and pains, not trusting your doctors, right? It's all there. And it's not just there. You go across the world and you'll see it in all these other places. So why do I bring it, why do I believe this is also important? Because I don't think we're apolitical in the big use of the word of polis, of our role as senior, as generals, all of you are as physicians, clinicians, senior respected citizens of your communities. We have a bigger responsibility. And it is a fundamental responsibility to human rights, right? The foundation of this democracy, the foundation of all democracies. The oath we take as officers is not to the Chief of Staff or the Secretary of Defense or to the President, is to the Constitution, to the principles that anchor this nation and all democratic countries. And we are responsible because people come to us in a trusted, sacred relationship, one-to-one, to help them what is fundamental and most important to them. And we are the ones who are the agents of protecting their individual rights. And that's how we're generals. That's how, in that tactical moment, when we're there with that person, we have to be able to think strategically and understand that we are there as a safeguard. And we are there to promote what we most value and treasure. So that anchors the passion that you hear in my voice. And I do confess that even though I joke about not always right but never in doubt, it's a whole lot more muddled than you think. I know it is. But even though it's muddled, I feel I have a responsibility, and we all have a responsibility to do the best that we can, right? Well, I'm not smart enough to remember Edmund Burke, but is it all that we need for evil to thrive is for good men to do nothing? Right? And we all strive to be good men and women. So, what does that mean for where we're going here? And what I'm going to say is that the implication is that we need to grasp and put forward a plan for how we're going to approach these patients, these populations, and help them have good lives and the best lives possible. The idea that we would have a model, though, I believe, for a number of reasons during the 80s, was fast cast away. And I don't want to be too critical, but I think our profession has been marginalized. And it was marginalized by the growth and the dominance of psychopharmacology. Okay? That just, one of my good other friends who was a general officer said, Steve, you know what's going to happen to us? He says, we can either be running backs or the owners and coaches and managers of these teams. Now, the running backs are going to get a lot of money, but you know what happens? They're going to get cast aside after a while. I think we better start thinking about being coaches and managers. But psychopharm has made us into running backs. And God bless all these randomized controlled trials coming out of exposure therapy and desensitization and all that. But all these manualized protocols, they've also ended up marginalizing us in ways. Because we find ourselves incredibly channeled and controlled by those people who tell us, what's going to be paid for and what's sanctioned, what works. The fact is, and here are the items that I think should be gleaned in going towards a model. First of all, you look at the studies of the Institute of Medicine, one published in 2007 on PTSD. Their review of all these trials was that really none of the treatments can be shown convincingly to have effect. The only treatment that possibly had some marginal effect was exposure therapy, but that was not even then overwhelmingly convincing. Right? So, what is the implication of that? Let your mind flow a little bit. The implication is, these guys are malingerers. They're not real. We don't need to pay for their treatment. How many op-eds have you read where they're saying, well, they're just soaking the VA system. We better be careful. We don't want to spend too much money on these men and women, right? Because none of the treatments work. How do we know that they're really sick? Their IOM is doing another review now. We'll see how that comes out. Second review that the IOM did was that substance abuse and alcohol abuse, which is incredibly common in this, not in the Muslim population, obviously not in Gitmo, but at least in our American soldiers, substance abuse is widespread. Ask your soldiers, Marines, and when you get their trust, how much hash they smoked in Afghanistan. No one talks about it. And they all know how to keep their urine clean. Right? They all know how to do that. But best case is, I was part of the defense for the sport killings at Fort Lewis. You remember those kids? Yeah. The E4s, the sergeants were very smart. The sergeant who organized it was very smart. He never smoked hash. He had all his E4s smoking. And he had them, therefore, under control. He could psychologically blackmail these kids. So you've got the substance abuse issue ends up being very important. It also is important because it is one of those things that is less stigmatized. And you can use it as sort of the gateway to getting the young person into treatment, as you to start to say, well, let's clean you up here a little bit. So we've clearly got also an entire set of symptoms that show a sympathetic discharge, right? This hyper-excitable, hyper-vigilant state. All of which we've quite not figured out what's going to work. And there may not be one thing for one person. It may be that people need desensitization and calming and meditation. There are some pain specialists that use what's called a stellate ganglion block. It is probably not harmful, seems to work, and calms the sympathetic system down. What I'm building towards is to say that, going back to Freud, you might want to You might want to invoke George Engel and biopsychosocial model. I'm not quite sure how to do it. So let's take all that biological stuff and say it's in the id. Right? Let's just pack it up there and look at what neuronal functioning is, and look at the frontal lobes, and look at what the connections are, and look at sympathetic discharges, and look at neurotransmitters, and think about what methylation does, right? There's a whole now, people are talking about folate and methylation and NSAIDs. That's all interesting part. One of the other things that I thought part of the conversation in terms of these veterans and training is we don't think about neurodevelopment that much. Terry, as a 60-plus-year-old veteran, is not the 25-year-old girl in the movie. Things happen, as you've noticed, when you get older. Sometimes there are good things, and sometimes they're not so good. But things happen. Things happen, you know, in the central nervous system. Things happen hormonally. Things happen in the adrenals. Things happen in the thyroid. Things change. I think, particularly in defense work that I do, I'd like to point to a Supreme Court decision in 2009 of Graham versus Florida. There were amicus briefs by the American Psychiatric, the American Psychological, and the American Academy of Child and Adolescent. Because they did, in fact, bring together the best neurodevelopment data from 18 to 25. Very, very important to think about what the changes are and what the trajectory of those changes are. Is it any surprise that someone who does something at 22 may think of it differently at 33 or 40? Of course not. But we don't factor that into the way that we build our treatment programs and treatment models. So there's all that bag of biological id. There's then that bag of stuff that I'd call the ego, you know, and sort of more psychological of learning and relationships and defense mechanisms and a way of being able to map some behavioral techniques or cognitive behavior therapy into sophistication and progression along defense mechanisms and other ways of learning, how nonverbal people would learn, and perhaps how we would then also be able to show that it maps their frontal lobes. But there is that, and some of that's that epigenetic part that happens because of that ego and daily interaction. And then the last part that, of course, this conference is very involved with has to do with the superego and the moral parts of it. What are the injunctions that these people bring to their combat experience from their various backgrounds, and what are the injunctions that they learn over time? Now, you know, we don't look at that. We're not asking the question, what is the kid in 2010 or 2012 like coming into the military? What's their social experience? What's their moral imperatives? What do they learn? And what do you learn from 18 to 25 to 30 in a way that you have a moral perspective and an ethical perspective on life? And when you go to 50 or 60. One of those things I think that needs to be paid attention to is fundamental to the Army culture and that is drilled into every new recruit's head. And that's the soldier's creed. I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to think about in your own mind what the implications would be if you don't feel that you're quite what you're expected. So the soldier's creed goes like this. I will always place the mission first. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. Right? Does it, all the things that you're talking about, are they not all there? I'm weak, I'm injured, I don't want to do this, I don't think it's right, I couldn't do this, I wasn't fast enough. It's all there. And I think that it's going to be fundamental for the Army to start at that basic level, because it's now going to go through a huge reset period. We did this 20 years ago after the Gulf War. We did this 40 years ago. We're going to come out of Afghanistan and Iraq no matter who wins this presidential election. We're going to downsize the active Army by 80,000. We're going to downsize the Marines by 35,000. All the contractors are going to want to buy all the airplanes and ships and all toys that they can get to make lots of money. But we're going to be downsizing the people. And when we downsize, then if you're broken and not as weak or whatever it is, you're out. There's no room for people who have served extremely well but have come back hurt. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with, and because I've managed not to tie this all together, is to say that we need to tie it together, and that we need to be thinking about this at a higher level. And I was captured as a young person by then probably something that was too nascent or primitive, by general systems theory. But it seemed to make sense in a complex world that I was finding myself exposed to, and that somehow was not the way, particularly medical school, which was high school on steroids, was really playing out. And so I'll close with this quote. As we analyze the thing into its parts or into its properties, we tend to magnify these, to exaggerate their apparent independence, and to hide from ourselves, at least for a time, the essential integrity and individuality of the composite whole. We divided the body into its organs, the skeleton into its bones, as in very much the same fashion we make a subjective analysis of the mind, according to the teaching of psychology, into component factors. But we know very well that judgment and knowledge, courage or gentleness, love or fear, have no separate existence, but are somehow mere manifestations or imaginary coefficients of a most complex integral. So I charge you all, as my fellow generals and admirals, that we have an obligation to champion a much more humane and holistic approach to our patients and to our loved ones. With all humility, I tell you, I feel we should stand up and say that this is what we do, and this is why we do it, and we do it damn well. Thank you.
Steve, thank you very much. I think we'll take just a couple of questions, have a very short break, and then have our plenary with all of the presenters. So, yes, right here.
Thank you very much. Especially appreciate your caring for the torture. Carl Menninger years ago said, love not only cures the person who receives it, also the person who gives it. I imitate that about torture. Torture not only destroys the person who receives it, also the person who gives it. Did you see any PTSD on torture when you went?
Yes, huge. There's well, and if you look at the Cotter, if you get some of the stuff on him that you can get off the internet, you'll see a caption from a fellow. There are many others like him. He was an interrogator named Damien Corsetti. And he's 100% disabled. He'll tell you that. Josh Phillips wrote a book. None of us were like this before, and he has gotten through and and really narrated the stories of a number of people who are feeling that. I think it's there as I talk to them. One of the things I didn't mention, and it's a peculiar thing that breaks down, is so you're trained in the Army when you go, every officer or enlisted, you go to basic, you go to the firing range, and you're trained that that is a target. That man right there is a target. He's not a man. Right? In order to do what we do, we have to fire our weapon. We have to depersonalize, right, the target. I think we lose, and I feel that these men and women lose, as we all do as we get older, the capacity to do that. Okay? Some of them keep it. You know, it is really strong. I've got one fellow who is now about 40, wounded in Mogadishu. He did some stupid things. He's doing his time, all white collar. Bad PTSD, undiagnosed bipolar. When he'd be going into a high phase, he'd go into the blackest of the black ops. Okay? I mean, and if he was feeling like he was going to low phase, he'd get a bunch of stimulants, and because he had the capacity to depersonalize like that. It's breaking down a little bit now. It would break down at times for him. He knows that. But even in the situation where I finally said to him when it was clear that he was bipolar, you know, you're getting older, you're going to have more depressive periods than manic periods. Things are going to get really tough, and they might get really tough, and a lot of guys commit suicide. He says, I've taken a lot of guys out. I know how to do that, sir. It is the capacity to depersonalize and then to do that to yourself is not uncommon in these guys who want to commit suicide. A lot of guys are traumatized from the torture that they've inflicted.
One last question over here. Someone over here had a question.
My name is Dina Malone, and I just wanted to share my perspective because I think it's unique. I'm a retired Air Force.
Let take this.
My name is Dina Malone. I just wanted to share my perspective because I think it's unique in that I am a veteran and also I'm a clinician. I was an Air Force nurse, and now I'm a veteran nurse. And I just wanted to validate the different speakers' topic of discussion that yes, those are all very true, what you talked about, that sleep deprivation is one of the most important things that we need to treat initially. And color therapy and the box, that's very symbolic and it works. And then the resentment issues, it's so true that we have this resentment because we feel that we were betrayed in many ways. And the veterans that I see say that and confirm that. In general, I wanted to thank you for tying in everything and giving us that perspective of what it's like to be the one in charge and the one who makes decisions for everybody. You, however, didn't mention the Air Force general. Any perspective in that? What was their attitude?
The problem, you know, I'm a son of an Air Force officer. And, you know, in some of the navies, as Mike Mullen was saying, they're very removed. You know, except for the ones that are IMAs, individual augmentees. Now, the air-evac flights and those nurses, and I went with a bunch of the C-17s directly from Afghanistan back to the U.S. You know, that's tough for those because these kids, I say kids, I mean they're all, you know, these young men mostly who ID blast and then they're amputated immediately here. 48 hours later, they're at Andrews Air Force Base, and it is tough to keep these kids alive in this flying ICU. So they're having a particular hard time. The other group that's having a hard time are the pilots flying the drones. That's being kept under the radar, so to speak. And but You know, here these guys are in Nellis Air Force Base. They're flying these drones. They take out a target. They see it up close and personal, and then after a while, it begins to get to them. They're going home to family and kids, and it's a really hard shift. I think the shifting piece is really tough.